climate change poses threats to Vietnam's economic development. Vietnam's efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of BizLight. I'm Hoàng Nguyên. To achieve the goals of sustainable development, environmental protections, and respond to climate change, Vietnam is transitioning its economy towards a green and circular model. The country also affirmed its commitment to net zero emissions by year 2050 and put the green economy at the core of development. Vietnam is also active in international commitments toward green economic development. Synchronously developing markets related to the green economy is a solution for Vietnam to mobilize international resources to implement green transitions. And let's learn about Vietnam's effort in using financial tools to respond to climate change and promote green economic development in this week's BizLight. But first, join us in the following story about the challenges that Vietnam's economy faces due to the impact of climate change.
The Central Highlands has a total of over 5 million hectares of land devoted to agriculture, accounting for more than 91% of the region's natural land. The severity of this year's drought has made local authorities and people to struggle against drought every day. Agricultural crops and socio-economic goals will be severely affected if the drought continues. In the 40 degrees Celsius heat, many farmers had to scrape layers of muds to get fresh water to save rice. It is not enough to save these vast fields.
Nó cạn hết nước từ trên kia rồi không có kiếm được nước thì năm nay nhà có khoan cái nước ở trong ruộng này mà giờ bơm nó không ra nước không biết ra sao.
Rivers and streams dried up, soils are burning and thousands of hectares of crops have died. Farmers are struggling to find water sources for irrigation and for daily use.
We have a number of issues about managing the water source down there that make agriculture in the Mekong extremely difficult. And of course we know the Mekong is unbelievably important, not only to Vietnam, but as the food basket for Indochina almost. And the reliance on the Mekong River is so important.
Tourism, an important economic sector of Vietnam, will also suffer significant losses due to the impacts of climate change. Famous tourist destinations are at risk of being affected by rising sea levels and high temperatures.
As you can see right now, we're going through an extreme heat wave. And with this heat wave, what is the biggest thing we use is, of course, air conditioners. The load factor of energy that's being consumed at the moment is it's 20 to 30% more than regular. And the climate change is affecting everywhere.
According to a World Bank's research, climate change could cause Vietnam to lose about 12% to 14.5% of GDP each year by 2050 and might put approximately 1 million people into extreme poverty by 2030. Climate change will also affect Vietnam's sustainable development goals, requiring Vietnam to transform its development model from an economy dependent on fossil fuels and natural resources to a green economy, reducing carbon emissions to adapt to climate change.
Vietnam is a country with a very long coastline, lots of relatively low-lying cities and river deltas, and therefore, with regards to climate change, it established itself as one of the most susceptible or vulnerable countries to climate change. So without proper adaptation and mitigation measures, it's estimated that climate change will probably cost Vietnam about 12 to 15% of its GDP per year by 2050. But the adaptation measures should really focus on the country's most vulnerable sectors and locations like agriculture, transport, trade, and coastal areas. The annual losses are projected to escalate over time, as I've said, and the obstacles are going to be substantial, requiring a bit of a holistical approach to addressing these.
To discuss policy development efforts promoting green economic growth, we are connecting with Professor Dr. Andreas Stoffer, Country Director of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, FNF in Vietnam, and Mr. Christopher Zeffrey, Chairman of British Chamber of Commerce in Vietnam. Well, thank you, our guests, for joining our program. Drought and saltwater intrusions have recently emerged as serious threats to the Mekong Delta and causing annual economic losses of more than $206 million. In 2023 alone, natural disaster reduced the Vietnamese economy by $325 million. How would you assess the economic damage caused by climate change in Vietnam?
I can say that throughout Vietnamese many thousand years of history, there always have been disastrous natural disasters and events. Climate and weather always have been subjected to changes in Vietnam. There have been a lot of floods in the delta of the Red River. Also, the tropical storms in central Vietnam, that's not completely new, and this is not a matter of the 21st century. That also happened in the past very often. And you mentioned the figures of causing losses of more than $206 million. I think the figures can be also much higher in the future. And we should have in mind that this is mainly caused by, firstly, by the dams on the upper Mekong, which is preventing the Mekong water to come to reach the delta of the Mekong, and that's inevitably causing the saltwater intrusion, and this is something Vietnam has to do. And I think blaming all the issues on the climate change, to do it monocausally and to neglect all the other problems beside the existing climate change would be not so promising. It would be good to deal with all the problems and to see the environment protection as one of the major goals of Vietnam.
Obviously, it has a financial cost, which you've just said, but also I think it's a broader problem. And what we do today won't come into effect for many years. So we have to live with this and try and prevent it as much as possible now, affecting the economy and people's lives. But it's something which is here to stay. And it's not just Vietnam, it's global. And we need to be prepared for it and support the government and ensure that we minimize the permanency of any damage and we minimize the disruption to people's lives, people's health, but also the economy.
At the annual Vietnam Business Forum 2024 and recently the ASEAN Future Forum 2024, Prime Minister Phạm Minh Chính affirmed Vietnam identifies green growth and digital transformation as two core issues, two sides of one process that must always be valued. Along with that, the economic structure, converting the growth model from brown to green, Vietnam does not accept the model of growth first, clean up later. What do you think about this message in Vietnam Green FDI attraction strategy?
I fully agree with it. You can't have one without the other nowadays. I think if you're looking at investment and FDI investment especially, many investors throughout the world have green criteria, and they are only willing to support and invest if a country is taking it seriously. And it kind of comes back to that fundamental thing, which is about partnership and working together. So it's not just about immediate growth. It has to be sustainable growth. Investment today has to be effective throughout the next 10, 20, 30 years and for the next generation.
What do you think about this, Mr. Stuffer?
I fully agree to the statements by Prime Minister Chính on the two conferences. I think it is very important to focus on the two pillars mentioned by the Prime Minister. First of all, the digital transformation as well as the green growth. These two pillars are very essential. To postpone every activity for environment protection, for green transformation, for digitalization, for the time when Vietnam is already an industrialized country in the year 2045, what I strongly believe that Vietnam can achieve it. Let's give the example of the saltwater intrusion in the Mekong Delta. If you don't do something against the saltwater intrusion now, in 20 years, it will be too late. I think the costs would be immense, and Vietnam could not shoulder these costs.
The Green Growth Strategy establishes four objectives: reducing greenhouse gas emissions, making economic sector more sustainable, promoting responsible consumption, and ensuring a green transition process. And so what are your thoughts on these commitments?
They're excellent. And really, as we said previously, it's about bringing all these things together to form a policy, to form laws, regulations that enable them to come together. Any one on their own is useful, but what we've got to be realistic about is, on their own, they aren't going to change the world. They aren't going to save the world from climate change or the effects of it. So governments throughout the world have to bring together all these disparate elements to create an agenda, to create a framework, policies, laws, regulations, to ensure that their countries, and in this case Vietnam, is ready for the future and is not only reacting, but actually proactively preparing for the next generation, the next decade, and investment criteria that companies and countries will have for investment.
Vietnam is positioning itself for future development by embracing green growth, aiming for a carbon-neutral economy. To achieve this goal, many localities have been focusing on prioritizing support for businesses aiming at green production. Leveraging the supportive policies for green production in Ho Chi Minh City, this company has proactively pursued a green transformation, emphasizing technological innovation and integrating green standards into its production and operations. Notably, the company has spearheaded the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources.
Yếu tố con người, nhân sự của chúng ta đòi hỏi là nhân sự chúng ta là phải có trình độ cao, phải có cái kỹ năng làm việc theo nhóm. Thì đây là cũng cần chúng ta phải đào tạo, cần phải kiên trì để chúng ta đưa vào trong cái hệ thống để là phát triển tốt hơn.
The plastic recycling sector has long been associated with environmental pollution. However, with the support policy from the authorities, this business is reshaping that perception. Investing $60 million, the company has established a factory employing bottle-to-bottle technology, capable of recycling plastic bottles up to 50 times. As a result of its green initiatives, this enterprise has become the first recipient of a green credit certificate from HSBC.
Khi mà thế giới họ phát triển lên một cái tầm là tầm xanh thì họ sẽ yêu cầu các doanh nghiệp phải có những chứng chỉ xanh để có thể xuất khẩu sang Mỹ hoặc châu Âu. Và đấy là cái minh chứng rõ ràng cho việc là kinh tế xanh không phải là nhu cầu nữa mà nó là một bắt buộc trong tương lai khi chúng ta tiến ra sân chơi thế giới.
Committing to net zero is both a responsibility and an opportunity for the business community. The author ties have been issuing many support policies to encourage enterprises deploy green transformation.
Bộ Khoa học Công nghệ cũng đưa ra cái quỹ nghiên cứu khoa học công nghệ ở trong các doanh nghiệp. Thì hiện nay các doanh nghiệp người ta đang quan tâm nghiên cứu những cái vấn đề thuộc về kinh tế tuần hoàn và kinh tế xanh. Chúng tôi nghĩ rằng người tiêu dùng cũng cần phải ủng hộ những cái đổi mới này.
Entering 2024, Ho Chi Minh City pays special attention to building synchronous and practical policy frameworks. These serve as the basis to accelerate the green transformation while mobilizing resources from domestic and foreign entities to engage in this inevitable green shift.
Despite Vietnam having many regulations for the implementation of green credit, many businesses face challenges when implementing a circular economy. In your opinion, what are the reasons for this?
I think one of the key things, in my view, is people don't understand it yet. That's even people within the business environment and the green sector. It's new. And that requires, it's a new language, it's a new understanding. And people need to learn that language and understand what it means in reality. And so it's the same with green credit and everything like that. So I think it's one of education. It's one of ensuring everyone is clear what it means, within the Vietnamese context and the global context.
Many people believe that despite regulations, green capital still flows slowly due to the lack of clear guidelines and regulations for controlling emissions, as well as defining what is green in Pacific areas. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's a change of mindset. Vietnam went through a period of massive growth, but now we need people to understand that the world has changed and the priorities of the world and the priorities for the climate and environment have changed. So just like every country, I think it's the report card would be doing well, but could do better. We're not there yet. And I think that will take time because it is generational. And what governments and business chambers and funders need to do is to work together to speed up that process of understanding and getting people fully engaged in it.
Mr. Stoffer, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think you are absolutely right. And you mentioned the problems of the definition. I think definitions are very ambiguous, and you cannot see sometimes one definition is equivalent to the other definition. I think we should have to work on very clear guidelines here in Vietnam in order to create also legal certainty. That means if a company is investing in Vietnam and is very convinced that it's a green project they are investing in, it should be very clear and should not be changed after that. And I would like to mention one point, which is not so much related directly to the legal framework and to the business, but to PR. I would wish Vietnam to focus more on an own consistent PR strategy to attract more capital, to invest, to attract more investment, and to be more attractive for trade partners, especially from the European Union.
Vietnam is focusing on reducing domestic greenhouse gas emissions through various solutions. In addition to selling carbon credits to other countries, the nation has prioritized nature-based adaptation strategies in agriculture. This approach positions the environment at the heart of climate response and humanity at the core of sustainable development. In certain areas, these nature-based agriculture models have begun to show promising results. This farmer from Cà Mau province was advised against free-roam shrimp cultivation as part of a new nature-based agriculture initiative. The increasing effects of climate change have made the 40-year-old cultivation technique impractical. Recently, he adopted a new practice that involves clearing the pond and cultivating breeding shrimp 20 days before their release. This method has helped him achieve high yields before drought and saltwater intrusion start to damage farmable areas.
Mình ở hướng đây thì nó hao hụt thì mình kiểm soát được. Còn thả dưới thì mắc mình đâu có hay. Được 60% thì hoặc là 70%.
It's widely recommended that farmers follow this technique. They need customers for their products, a highly connected transport network, and lower delivery costs. These were some of the main issues discussed at the conference on mobilizing resources for nature-based agriculture in Cà Mau province.
Chúng ta kết nối các cái nguồn lực từ các cái định chế tài chính, từ các cái quốc gia cũng như là các tổ chức quốc tế. Thông qua diễn đàn này chúng ta định nghĩa lại cái thế nào là thuận thiên và cái cách tiếp cận quốc tế đối với thuận thiên là như thế nào.
The way to move forward is to connect all this success, build up on the best practices, but also in parallel engage the private sector.
There needs to be very, very clear plans of action about what the effects of climate change are likely to be. I think the government really needs to have some focus groups, some workshops to involve foreign investors to see what the ideas are. Like, what are we doing overseas? Let's look at best practice. Let's look at ways to really mitigate the effects of climate change.
By attracting human, technological and especially financial resources from all stakeholders, Vietnam aims to expand nature-based agriculture. This approach is crucial to the sector's objective of cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by 2030.
Vietnam and a group of international partners have announced the Partnership Agreement on Equitable Energy Transition, JETP. The agreement aims to mobilize $15.5 billion in public and private financing over the next 3 to 5 years to support the green transitions. However, this amount is still very small compared to the World Bank's estimate of $380 billion needed to achieve the net zero emission target. And where can Vietnam raise additional capital to achieve this target?
You're completely right. First of all, it's an ambitious target. And secondly, it requires a huge amount of money. And I think what you mentioned before, for example, the GETP is a very, very important step. And I think it's a significant initiative to support Vietnam's green development. And I think if you put it in line with ADB's commitment of giving $2.1 billion for Vietnam for the implementation of the GETP and the energy transition mechanism, I think that's very important. And there are also some other sources, for example, International Financial Corporation, IFC, which recently invested approximately $150 million in sustainable bonds and issuance of sustainable bonds, and also the activities by the IDA, by the International Development Agency, by the World Bank, also by other foreign donors, because some international donors, they still have money and they would like to invest it into very interesting projects in Vietnam. The government of Vietnam could support by giving access to affordable loans, to loans with preferred credit rates, or with taking out the risk by giving some kind of grants. The areas in which this activities should be.
So how do you evaluate the potentials to attract green capital?
I think there are a number of different avenues, and Vietnam as a country is exceptionally successful in receiving funding opportunities and utilizing investment to achieve its goals. JETP and the conversion transition is not going to happen overnight. So what we need to do is keep our eyes and focus on the endpoint, net zero, but also we have to take step by step. So this is a good start, and hopefully momentum will be built up and opportunities will arise during the period of that transition. The one thing I have learned about living in Vietnam and working in Vietnam is if Vietnam sets its mind on achieving something, it achieves it. And I have faith that yet again, Vietnam will prove itself a success in that way and make sure that it does achieve its commitments, and is probably one of the most successful global winners in this transition.
Vietnam recently received $9.9 million from the World Bank, equating to 20% of the remaining amount from the Emissions Reduction Purchase Agreement for 2018 to 2024. The World Bank has previously disbursed $40 million, equivalent to 80% of the agreement. This funding is crucial for supporting forest protection in 6 north-central provinces of Vietnam. The Vietnam Forest Protection and Development Fund has already disbursed Phase 1 funds to localities and made payments to forest owners. This sets the stage for Vietnam to launch a carbon credit market in the near future.
Cá nhân là các chủ rừng, rồi các cái liên quan đến các đối tượng mà thứ yếu ở các địa phương. Còn đối với chủ rừng chỉ được 10%. Thì đây là cái điểm khác, điểm mới mà chúng tôi đưa vào cái dự kiến là thí điểm lần này, để sau đó sẽ tổng kết đánh giá và báo cáo liên quan đến khi mà ban hành ra cái chính sách cho toàn quốc.
At present, the funds received from the first phase have been distributed among the 6 provinces participating in the agreement. Notably, 96.5% is allocated to the Forest Protection and Development Fund of these provinces. From this, 90% is further divided among forest owners and local communities involved in forest protection. Although Vietnam transferred only 10.3 million tons of carbon to the World Bank, it actually possesses a total of 16.2 million tons of carbon. Consequently, Vietnam still retains 5.9 million tons of measured carbon. This fact attests to the effective protection of forests.
Bộ Nông nghiệp Phát triển Nông thôn đề xuất với Thủ tướng Chính phủ là cho thực hiện cái quyền mua của Ngân hàng Thế giới 1 triệu. Còn lại đề xuất với Ngân hàng Thế giới kết nối với đơn vị có nhu cầu giảm phát thải để mua. Một cái phương án thứ hai nữa là giao cho Bộ Tài chính chủ trì phối hợp với Bộ Nông nghiệp Phát triển Nông thôn, Bộ Tài nguyên Môi trường.
According to experts, the green financial market in Vietnam has seen many positive changes. Vietnamese businesses have initially attracted green bond capital in the international market. The carbon market promises to bring new and sustainable sources of income for Vietnam's agriculture and forestry in the future. Vietnamese credit institutions have taken the initiative to access international capital sources for green credit, promulgating internal regulations on the green credit framework.
I think the potential for green energy investment in Vietnam is really very significant. From that commitment to energy transition, we'll see a movement from traditional energy sources to new and clean energy sources. The policy direction is there, the planning is there, and so the pathway for private sector investment into significant amounts of clean energy development is very much been established.
Mechanisms and policies for the green financial market in Vietnam are being gradually improved in each type of instrument, such as Green Society Sustainable Bonds, GSS, green stocks, carbon markets, and green credit. The current regulatory environment is relatively open for green financial products in Vietnam. It helps businesses mobilize domestic and international green capital.
The carbon credit market is expected to serve as a lever for green economic development. And what are your thoughts on Vietnam's efforts to establish a mechanism for the carbon credit market?
Carbon credit market is a very important tool because Vietnam could use its own resources, for example, via preventing deforestation and planting more trees, for example, to work on that and also to make the own industry greener than it was before. I think this is very important for Vietnam to work on that. And I think the carbon credit mechanism is a very good one because Vietnam could integrate into the system of carbon credit markets in the world. And that would be at the end very positive for the economic development and the green transition in Vietnam on the way to become an industrialized nation by 2045.
How should we properly understand green growth and attract green investment in a way that doesn't negatively impact the country's overall development?
It is very important for Vietnam to grow, to get richer, to become an industrialized nation by 2045, to let the Vietnamese people become richer. And then also it goes hand in hand, the increasing wealth goes hand in hand with the increasing perception and increasing responsibility for the environment protection. That doesn't mean that you should postpone it to later. Vietnam is already on the way to become a rich country, an industrialized country, and at the same time on the way, Vietnam can also focus on green transition and green growth.
What about you, Jeffrey? What do you think about this?
Well, I think, again, you have to put it in context that there may be short-term detrimental effects on growth. But would you rather have a slower growth rate this year, next year, the year after, and be a success 10, 15 years down the line with a sustainable economy? And I think that's what people have to understand, that, again, you need to invest. And it's not just money investing, but maybe it's a short slowdown or slightly slower growth, let's say, in terms of GDP. And that is a worthwhile cost to ensure that 10, 20, 30 years down the line, that Vietnam's economy is thriving, is sustainable, and is at the forefront of the ASEAN nations, if not in a global context.
Well, once again, thank you, our guests, for joining our program. Vietnam is among the most vulnerable countries and urgently needs to adopt adaptive solutions. In 2023, extreme weather impacts led to an economic loss of over $325 million. Experts recommend that Vietnam devise a strategy for sustainable resilience. And without this, natural shocks could potentially wipe out billions of dollars in economic growth and efforts over the next decade. Vietnam has committed to achieving net zero by 2050, increasing the proportions of renewable energy to over 30% of the total primary energy supplied, and achieving a forest coverage rate of 43%. And this demonstrates the strong determinations of the Vietnamese government in building a green economy. The approval of the Green Economic Development Strategy by Prime Minister Phạm Minh Chính is the clearest evidence of Vietnam's determinations to restructure the economy towards green development. And this lays the groundwork for the country's future, setting significant milestones for 2030, 2045, and beyond. It also provides Vietnam with the opportunity to lead the region in green growth, aligning with global development trends. And on that note, we wrapped up this edition of BeSlides, and stay with it for more content, or you can download our app VTV Go from the App Store or Google Play for additional content. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time.